we're going to get started because we're going to make a real effort to start on time and get you out on time. So I promise to do that. Before I get started, and just real quickly, my name is Matt Condon. I'm President and CEO of Athletic and Rehabilitation Center, and thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us here today. Your time is really valuable, and we appreciate you taking it to be with here. I am really genuinely and profoundly excited about today's seminar because I know all of the speakers, and I'm really excited about it. So I think you're in for a great day today. I think it's going to be really valuable for you. Real quickly before I get started, I do this at most of them, and I always worry it becomes disingenuous, but it's not. Leslie, Christy, Mary, Pam Bashir, Brian Stewart, and probably about 18 other people that I am not mentioning right now put this whole thing on. And they organized it all. If we give them a round of applause, I appreciate it. They work really hard at it, and then I show up 15 minutes before it starts, and people think I had something to do with it, and really I had nothing to do with this whole event. And so I want to make sure that they get the credit that is due to them before we get started. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We will break after our second speaker at about 10:10, so you can kind of plug that in. There are restrooms up and out the doors in the halls, out here in the hallways. There's going to be a lot of folks out there to help direct you, so I don't think you'll miss them. We'll be there to kind of help make sure everybody navigates to where they need to be. That being said, we hope anyone who has follow-up questions of any of the panelists will have a few minutes to stay after. Any of the speakers and the panelists. We want this to be a day of dialogue and of communication. This is a day about pushing things outside of the box and taking a new perspective on healthcare and healthcare costs. And so my guess is there will be a lot of questions and comments. If you don't have time to have them asked and answered during any of the sessions, I think most of our speakers and panelists have made themselves available to kind of hang out afterwards. So I certainly encourage you to do so. And again, that being said, don't wait if you don't have to. So if there's an opportunity to ask questions and someone's being quiet, I encourage you to do so, because probably a question that you have is one someone else does as well. And we want to make sure that they're asked and people hear about it. We're here today to talk about healthcare reform, in part, about what it is and what it is not. But mainly, we want to talk about, frankly, why it doesn't matter. And where, as we head into the next generation of health and healthcare management, why employers and providers have to take a different perspective, have to look at things in a different way, and have to go from providing reactive care to proactive solutions to our clients, our partners, and our employers in the marketplace. We're going to talk about some things that are too slow to hit this market and are coming here quickly, and we're going to talk about some things that will inevitably hit this market and every other market in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. We're going to talk about measuring outcomes. We're going to talk about preventative care and proactive management of health in your workforce. We're going to talk about what strategies that these great speakers have seen work, and then what some practical programs and impact that you can implement to your organization. We're going to talk about, again, innovative thought and thinking outside the box. And this is the kind of stuff that I love, right? I love this kind of organic conversation about the way health and healthcare spending and this world, maybe not how it is today, but how it ought to be tomorrow, and how people in this room can lead that charge tomorrow. We're going to talk also, at the end, we have some panelists that have implemented and executed on strategies in their own organizations. And I'm excited about that, because you can talk about philosophy a lot, but we're going to have an opportunity to hear from people that have implemented some really creative strategies in their organizations today. And I think that kind of practical experience is something everybody's often looking for. So about the program. Karen McLeese is here today and is in-house counsel for CBIZ. And she's here to talk more thoroughly and explain not only the recent Supreme Court decision, but also where healthcare reform is heading and how all of us can be prepared, whether we're providers, whether we're intermediaries and consultants or assistants in the system, or whether we're employers. Then we'll have David Wetzler, president of SRA, talk about getting to true healthcare cost transparency. You're going to hear about this for the next 10 years probably, figuring out where true healthcare cost transparency is. And I know David and SRA have done remarkable things in really getting to where cost is and being able to articulate it and then helping their clients navigate it. It's hard to lower costs. It's frankly impossible to lower costs if you can't accurately measure it and measure it comprehensively. So we're excited to have David here to speak about that. Our last real speaker is Karen Wolf, and I'm excited about all of our speakers, but I'm really excited about Karen. Karen is president and CEO of MedMetrics. Karen got the memo wrong. She came here today from Bend, Oregon. I told her that I was going to take this thing to Bend, Oregon to her, but somehow she missed that and came here to Kansas City instead, and we're dealing with 110-degree weather instead of the probably 60 or 70-degree weather that she would experience where she is. But I'm so excited to have her because Karen in particular is pushing forward into this new world of really measuring healthcare costs with meaningful data. And so, and specifically in the workers' compensation area, which will likely be the first place that we really get a grasp of where healthcare dollars go and don't go and what's meaningful. And so I'm really excited to have Karen here. After that, I just kind of do a close-up, and you can tell who the most important speaker is not by the fact that my presentation may be 2 minutes or 5 or 8. It kind of depends on how much time is left. Everybody else gets to do their speaking, and then I just fill in the remainder. So I'm kind of the catch-all. It may be 30 seconds long, but I'll make sure that we stay on time through my presentation. After that, we'll have our panel. And I'm really excited about having those people here, and I'll introduce them as they come up here later on in the morning. But again, I think it's great after we get all this inspiration to hear about people who are doing it today and their organizations and the kind of outcomes that they're getting. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our first speaker, Karen McLeese. Karen is, again, in-house counsel for CBiz and a national speaker on the topic of healthcare reform. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, on MSNBC, in human resource industry publications, and a variety of other publications. Karen is she is a expert in this field. She also happens to be a friend. Her family tolerates my very loud young family in church every Sunday when they can't hear anything. But I've heard Karen speak before. I've heard, gosh, hundreds of healthcare reform speeches, and Karen is remarkable in this space. And so we're really honored to have her here today. And without further ado, Ms. Karen McLeese.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt. I am excited to be here. My favorite topic. Just don't ask me about MLR. I'm really tired of that topic this week. If any of you are dealing with it. We need to be done with it and move on to important things. Not that that's not important. So I need to begin by just getting something off my chest. You know, whether you have an appetite for healthcare reform or not, may be a subject of debate, but can I tell you what I don't have an appetite for? My just turned 16-year-old drove me down here today. I really don't have an appetite for that. But I got here safe and sound, so hopefully we'll get through healthcare reform safe and sound as well. And we will. So this morning I woke up to NPR as I usually do, and one of the little vignettes this morning was talking about the Olympic torch and the history of the Olympic torch and the carrying of the torch, which is very topical since the games start in a couple of days. And they pointed out that the bearing of the torch is a relatively new phenomenon. 1936, I think, is what they said. And it was carried, the games were in Berlin, and it was carried by, a very buff, no, if that term was used back then, but, Aryan young runner. And then the games were canceled during World War II, a couple of the games, so for 8 years, I guess. And then it began again, and then they talked about a number of the things that the number of the venues that the torch has been. It's been into space. It's been, to the top of Mount Everest. It's been a circuitous route. Some years more circuitous than others. They mentioned for the Beijing Games, it was a very circuitous route with many protests along the way and many opportunities to protect the torch against many protests. This year, it was the torch was really carried around Britain, and that the goal of the torch is to get within an hour of every citizen in Great Britain. So somehow, to me, that spoke to healthcare reform. The goal, I think we can all agree, is laudable. The route to get there might be circuitous. But I think for us today, what we as employers, as consultants, as participants in the healthcare system want to do is to make sure that we get it there safely. We may not agree with the it, but what I think we can all agree to is the human condition will continue to need medical care. I don't think that there's anything in the offing, there's no Nobel Prize that's going to be awarded to curing all ills of the human condition. People will get sick, and people will need to be cared for. So what we have to follow or continue the evolution of is how we're going to make sure that that can happen in the most economic way possible. And I don't just mean financially economic, but also from the point of view of good care, good quality care. So we want it to be efficient, we want it to be economic, and we want it to be valuable to all of us who need it. So with that said, I want to reiterate what Matt said, and that is please feel free to ask questions. I don't have a particular agenda that I need to get through, and I love these kinds of really more symposium-style programs where we can interact because it is a dialogue. It's not a lecture. So please feel free to interrupt. Raising your hand is not particularly useful for me, so feel free to just speak out. I grew up with 7 brothers, so I'm used to being interrupted. That's not a problem. So anyway, and also, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay afterwards. So let's make it a dialogue. It's only together that we're going to work with this piece of clay to create the sculpture that it needs to be. What I do want to do is talk about what the Supreme Court did and what it means. There's not, as I was saying to Brian earlier, nothing is indelible ink at this point. Everything is whiteboard or smartboard. Everything is subject to change, subject to evolution. But let's begin with the legal landscape. Then we'll talk about, just very briefly, some employer obligations that hopefully are already well in place. So we're going to get through that very quickly. And then we're going to talk about some next steps and some employer opportunities, which will then lead into the rest of the discussion for the day, hopefully. All right, so legal landscape. We're going to begin with the Supreme Court. As we all know, in March, the Supreme Court heard 3 days of hearings on the healthcare issue. They really are divided into 4 components. The first thing that the Supreme Court did is address the issue of whether they could even address the issue. It's always a good place to start. And it is known as the anti-injunction question. And so what the Supreme Court had to decide, there is a provision in the law that says that the court can't review something unless somebody has been harmed by it. So the question came up, is the individual, I'm not sure what word to use, and you'll see why in a minute, but is the individual issue, is the individual mandate, the requirement to have health coverage, and we'll talk more about what that means in a minute, but is it a tax or is it a penalty? Because if it's a tax and nobody has assessed that tax until 2014, so it's not payable until 2015, because as we all know, we pay our taxes the year after, besides all the ones that they withhold during the year, but that aside. So really, nobody would pay this tax until 2015. So if it's a tax, the Supreme Court can't even address the issue until 2015 after somebody has actually written the check to pay the tax. Or is it a penalty? If it's a penalty, then we as the court can address it. And what the court decided is, it's a penalty. It's not a tax. So therefore, we proceed to day 2. In day 2, what the Supreme Court did is address, again, the individual mandate. This requirement that pretty much all Americans maintain a certain level of coverage in 2014 or pay. Okay? Pay what? Yesterday, it was a penalty. Okay? So is it a penalty that they pay, or is it a tax that they pay? And that becomes relevant in the determination. So there were really three issues that were addressed in regard to the individual mandate. Was it within Congress's power under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to require that all Americans engage in interstate commerce? Because really, healthcare is interstate commerce. Very rarely is healthcare only locally delivered. I mean, the MRI machine is made in somewhere, and the prescription drugs are made somewhere else. I mean, there is a crossing of state lines, sometimes country lines. Okay, so the question was, could Congress require people to engage in interstate commerce? And the second question was, did Congress exceed its power under the necessary and proper clause? And that got little play, so we won't spend too much time on that. And then the third question was it within Congress's, okay, important word, taxing power? Okay, remember yesterday it was a penalty, but now, is it within Congress's taxing power to say that, individual, you either have to maintain a certain level of coverage or you pay a tax? So the two issues that got the most play were the issue of the Commerce Clause. Was it within Congress's power to require people to engage in interstate commerce? This issue has been addressed many times over the years by the Supreme Court. And so the four justices on the farther left side of the spectrum all said that yes, it is within Congress's power to require people to buy health coverage. I've actually never listened while it was going on to debate in the Supreme Court, with the exception of once when I was in law school where I actually got to go to the Supreme Court, which was neat. But it was fascinating. I mean, if you can separate yourself from the healthcare issue of it, the dynamic among the justices was entertaining at times and fascinating at other times, and the implications of this Supreme Court decision, which is not our subject today, will have long-reaching effect, far more, I think, than we can realize, and maybe even far more reaching than just its implication on health care. So anyway, the four liberal justices said that, yes, it's within Congress's authority to require people to engage in interstate commerce. The four justices on the more conservative side of the bench said, no, that was far out, overreaching. Congress can't do that. And then so that left it undecided. Then they got to the question of, was it within Congress's power to impose a tax? And again, the four justices on the left side said, yes, it was within Congress's power to impose this tax, if that's the way you want to look at it, was their thinking. The four justices on the right said it exceeded Congress's power to impose this tax. And this is where the deciding vote came in. So Chief Justice Roberts said, no, it is within Congress's taxing power to impose this tax. And that's how we got to a majority on the individual mandate. So not under the Congress's power to affect interstate commerce, not under the necessary and proper clause, but rather under Congress's power to tax, did we get to a majority decision. So with that, the next question that the Supreme Court addressed was, if it is decided that the individual mandate can't stand on its own, is it integrally related with the rest of the law such that the whole law has to fall, or can you just sever that piece of it? But they never had to get to that question because the individual mandate stood. There were some interesting arguments on that subject had they gotten to it, but they didn't. Though some of the discussion may ultimately bear out in other cases in the future. Then the final thing that they addressed was another piece of healthcare reform. And what that piece of the law says is that states, well, let me back up for a second. Currently, as we probably all know, Medicaid is currently a program primarily for pregnant women and children who meet certain financial guidelines, and for the disabled. This law would require all states to expand their Medicaid, and Medicaid is a federally funded program and state funded, so it's a jointly funded program run by the states. So the law said that states will have to expand Medicaid to everyone who earns below 133% of the poverty level. And we'll talk more in a little bit about why that's important. And what the law went on to say is that if a state doesn't, they lose all of their Medicaid funding. So what the Supreme Court said is that that was an overreach, and so several states, like 26 or something, challenged that. They said, Congress can't do that to us. I mean, think about it. States are in a huge financial problem right now. They're having budget crises in regard to funding schools and funding roads and funding infrastructure and all the things that states need to do. And here Congress is telling them that they have to expand Medicaid to millions of people. And so the states challenged that. Even though the program is going to be funded for the first 3 years by the federal government, thereafter the states would have to begin to kick in. And so what the Supreme Court said is that, yeah, that was an overreach of Congress's power. It's okay for Congress to say that states should expand Medicaid to people earning below 133% of the poverty level, but if a state should choose not to, the Congress can't take away all of their Medicaid funding. All they can take away is the additional funding that the state would get should the state decide to expand coverage to people, to the expanded group of people. So that's a question that is going to become very important when we really get down to the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen in 2014. We then need to move on to the Congress, but before we go there, I guess my thinking on this healthcare law is it's an access law. It's not a cost containment law. What this law, or the two laws, because there were two of them that were enacted in 2010, what they really do is expand access to health coverage. I think the hope is that partly by getting more people in the game, that costs will go down. But there are huge gaping holes in actually controlling the cost of health care, which is really going to impact, ultimately, some of the twists and turns of this torch as it moves along. And I think later on, going to probably be some great discussions on how, without regard to health care, we can get to some of these cost issues. So rather than waiting for some law to mandate things, I think as employers and consultants, we need to take the bull by the horns and move forward. So we've discussed what the Supreme Court did. The Congress has, ever since the law's enactment, introduced a number of bills that would do a variety of things, everywhere from repealing it altogether. The most recent one of those was introduced just a few weeks ago after the Supreme Court decision, to bills that would incrementally modify certain aspects of health care reform. We all know that we're in an election year. It's another little interesting vignette on the Olympics, that we will be spared some of the election rhetoric for a couple of weeks while we enjoy the Olympics. That's a good thing. It just so happens the Summer Olympics happen every election year. Isn't that great? Anyway, so I don't suspect that we will see any significant congressional action between now and the election. The election will be very telling, I think, but again, the Congress is one branch of three. We have also an election, of course, in the executive branch, and so depending on the outcomes, things could change, but realistically, probably not until the new administrations take effect or take their places after January. So Congress may come back after the election and they will have some things to deal with, but whether there will be anything significant in regard to health care is probably unlikely. Though there have been big laws passed in election years, but it's rare. And we aren't even going to go into all the various permutations that could happen. If we maintained a Republican House and got a Republican Senate and got a Republican in the White House, what that might mean versus a Democratic Senate and a Republican House and a Democrat in the executive branch, all of those permutations have a variety of results. And so we'll just kind of have to wait and see. It was interesting, though, in Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, one of the things he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically what he said is, it's not our job to change, how did he say it? Basically what he was saying is to affect the decisions that the people have made. So basically what he was saying is, if you want something changed, get out and vote. And then we have in the states have kind of been in a bit of a stalemate waiting for the Supreme Court decision. And here we are now, less than 18 months away from the crux of this healthcare law in 2014, and states are having to figure out, okay, do we establish exchanges? Just quickly, a state, according to the healthcare reform law, is required or to have an exchange. The exchange is like a marketplace where health coverage can be purchased and by primarily individuals and small groups. The state can either establish its own, it can do a federal-state partnership, or it can do nothing, in which case the federal government's going to come in and impose an exchange. Very little time to get all of that done. So that's what states are now having to, whether they're deer in the headlights or whether they're really going to act is going to be interesting, because they have very little time to get something done. The other thing that the states need to figure out now is the Medicaid issue. Remember, we talked about the fact that the states don't have to expand Medicaid to people earning up to 133% of the poverty level, but they are certainly encouraged to do so and will get additional funding if they do. So that's a question that needs to be figured out very quickly.